Oh my gosh. Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night, 7:12 p.m. Central. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. That's where Joe Montaldo is in New Orleans with his big antenna and all his casinos. And we got Bobby Dizzle here with us tonight.
What's up, folks? How's it going?
He's sitting in for Jay McNicholas. Jay had to work. And last night, Wham, aka Carol Matthews, was on his show about executioner stuff. So where can people find that? BobbyDizzle.com if they want to listen.
All the YouTube and audio links, iTunes and the whatnot. BobbyDizzle.com.
Nice.
It's up and posted as we speak.
Very cool. And our guest tonight is Ronnie Pontiac. It's great to have you here, Ronnie. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So is Pontiac your real name, or was that after a car? That's your real last name?
No, that was a nickname that I got, and it stuck when I was a guitar player. So
cool. And his band is American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric, and Mystical Traditions of the New World is the new book that you have coming out. Mm-hmm. And first off, tell us what band, Lucid Nation, and that's the band you play for?
Yeah. It's a band that started out in the 90s, like around 94, 95. We started out as a riot girl band in the punk grunge scene. And then later we became an anarcho-punk band, kind of. And then we morphed into kind of a stoner rock band. We just our main thing is we like to deconstruct genres. So we like to do mashups of different kinds of guitar-based music, mostly loud, aggressive stuff. But not always. Sometimes it's moody and weird and scary sometimes.
So what'd you think of the Gorge remake of Snoop Dogg's Gin and Juice back in the early 2000s? Talk about a mashup.
Yeah, I thought it was a breakthrough.
I love that song. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's not really my thing, but I got it. I get it.
And I was surprised about the Manly P. Hall. You were like an apprentice to that guy. That guy's pretty well known. And I mean, what's the story with that? That was the right Ronnie Pontiac that I read in the bio, right? I was
yeah. I was his research assistant for 7 years. I was his screener. And I was a designated public lecturer for him. Like when he couldn't, he was in his 80s at that time. So sometimes he just wasn't up to giving his Sunday morning lectures. And he decided that I was the guy to call on if he couldn't make it. And so I got to work with him on an almost daily basis for a long time. And it was an amazing experience. He was a really great human being to hang around with.
How did that happen? I mean, that sounds like something that should be a movie or something. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it was pretty strange because I was coming out of a background where I really wasn't into spiritual things except dark stuff. Like I was looking for power, and so I read things that I thought would give me power, like Anton LaVey and Crowley and Austin Spare. But I was disappointed in all of that stuff because it wasn't really evil enough for me as I was at that time. I'd grown up the only child of war survivors, and they were atheists. And I got my ass kicked all the way through school until I got mean. And so by the time I hit late teenage, I had no social contract. Like I didn't think I owed anything to anybody. And I was a real lover of the lie. I had discovered the power of the lie, and I used it as much as I could. And I had a band that was pretty big at that time locally. A lot of bikers and really violent kind of environment around us and around me. I was a petty criminal, and I was pretty violent myself. And the first thing that happened to change my life was I was at a club, and there was this girl there who didn't look like she belonged there at all. And she walked up to me as the club was closing, and she was really terrified because about 5 guys had kind of picked her out. And she didn't know what to do. She had nowhere to turn, and they were definitely trying to corner her. So even though the club owner told her to stay away from me because I was bad news, she thought that I was the right person to ask for some reason. And I did protect her that night, and we wound up falling in love. I'm still with her. And so that changed my life. She was a super honest person and didn't really get where I was coming from, but was tolerant. And so one book that had struck me when I was a kid was something I saw in a bookstore, and it was called Atlantis, the Mother of Empires. It was this big white book about Atlantis. And I wanted to shoplift the thing, but it was way too big, especially for a kid. But it stuck in my mind. It was one of the few spiritual things that kind of stuck in my mind. And so after I hooked up with her, I went to a famous bookstore in LA that's no longer there called the Bodhi Tree. It was one of those metaphysical bookstores. And I'd been given some money for a haircut by my parents, which was a joke. And I took it to try to find this book. And instead, I found an old copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, with the title, encyclopedic outline, etc. And I'd never heard of him or the book. It was this kind of big tome. It was black and white, but it had all the illustrations in it. And I took it home, and it just blew my mind. I mean, every chapter that I read seemed to just open new doors for me. And my point of view about life, which was that it was meaningless, that nihilism was the only way to approach anything, and that you did as much destruction as you could to show your cynicism about how people are trying to manipulate everyone and such. And so he changed this. All of a sudden I saw, like, whoa, there's all these people who explored on their own outside the traditional religions and institutions. They discovered spiritual paths. They discovered things about the soul, and they were risking their lives to do this and to share it by putting it into code and diagrams and diaries and books. And so what happened was I told a friend about this book, and she said, well, did you know he's still alive? I couldn't believe it, because I thought he was like in the 1890s or something. And she said, no, he's up in his 80s now, but he still lectures very near where you live every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. for $1. So I wanted to go, but I was afraid to. I thought that he would look through me. I thought the whole place would look through me. I lived such a rotten life, and I just thought that they'd not want me there at all. But after a few months, she convinced me to go. She said, what are you going to feel like if he's gone? You know, I mean, he's an old man. Don't you want to see him at least once? So I went down there one Sunday with her. It was a beautiful sunny day, and we paid our $1, and we walked in, and the people were so nice. It was mostly older people. They seemed shocked to find young people walking in. But the things that I heard around me, all these words and ideas that I'd never heard of, and names, and it just seemed like everybody had this passion for knowledge and for life. And then he came out, and he delivered a 90-minute lecture, no notes, dropping dates and author names, never making a mistake. And he looked right at me at one point. And the same person who told me that he was lecturing, she had scared me with Edgar Casey. She and her family were getting ready to move to Virginia because they thought California was about to drop off into the ocean because of a big earthquake. And she spooked me into thinking that I should move to Virginia. Anyway, he looked right at me and he said, the kind of people who experience irrational fears because of natural disasters such as earthquakes, when what is really wrong with them is they're guilty about how they've been living their lives. I was blown away. He also talked directly to my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, because he wanted us to marry. And she had been walking up to this place and had noticed some flowers, weeds that had blossomed growing through cracked concrete. And he looked right at her and said, there are people who are like these little flowers that grow up through the cracked concrete. Later, when I worked for him, I realized that he didn't see us. His vision was pretty bad at that time. And he just had this knack for doing that. I talked to many people who said that he had done the same thing when they came to their first lecture, and sometimes even repeatedly when they came to lectures. So I don't know what he was doing there. People said that he was psychic and he was channeling. Other people said that he was just in the Tao, or they said that he was a master, so he knew our souls and could see them, even though he couldn't see us. I really don't know what he was doing, but he was in the groove of something pretty amazing. And so I wanted to be part of his place and him and what he was doing and everything. So the next day, Tamara and I came down to try to get jobs or even to volunteer. And they liked her because she had office skills, but they didn't have anything for me. I was I was just a loser. And but they did ask, "Do you know anything about languages?" And so I had grown up around a family, all these war survivors who spoke many different languages, European languages. So I was familiar with them in a way. I mean, not really, but I at least had some kind of contact with these languages. So they took some notes, the secretary that was interviewing us, and we got a call. They offered Tamara a gig, and then they said that they were still looking for something for me. And I was not a cool person. I was like, hey, there's no way I'm staying home while you're working there. Screw them. Next day we got a call, and they said Manly Hall wants to meet you. And I was blown away. And so I went down there the next morning, and they showed me into his office, and there he was behind his beautifully carved, ornate Chinese desk, and he had a phalanx of women, these two old women on either side of him who were just giving me the skunk eye. And but he was super friendly and sweet, and he said, "Come in and make yourself miserable," in this kind of W.C. Fields accent. And I sat down in the chair, and he had a pile of paper in front of him. He pushed it in front of me, and he said, "This is the galley of my alchemical bibliography." I mean, I had just read about alchemy in his book. I didn't know what a bibliography was. I didn't know what a galley was. He said, "I want you to work on this, and you will be my editor for finishing it." And I said, "I'm so sorry, but I am not equipped to do that. I think you've got me mixed up with somebody else."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "No." He said, "I think you'll be fine." He said, "I'll help you do it, and you'll see, you'll be okay." And then he pushed it at me and said, "Go on, get started. Just go first to begin with, just do some proofreading and make sure spelling's okay. And then check and make sure that the measurements and other information about the title pages of the book and how many pages are accurate." Okay. So as I walk out, the vice president of the society, Pat Irvin, who was a veteran and ran the financial side of the place, she just grabbed it from me and said, "No, that was a mistake." And I said, "Thank you. Yeah, I can't do that, but I'm really honored, let him know." So I get home that afternoon, and there's another phone call, this time from his secretary. And she says, "You and Mr. Hall in his office at 9 a.m. Okay. So I showed up at 9 a.m. I walked in there. It was just him this time. And he said, "Sit down." The galley was still on his desk. And he said, "I really want you to do this. I am convinced that you will be able to do it. And I will help you. I will let you know what to do in the morning. I'll check your work in the afternoon. And for lunch, we can sit in the vault. And you can pick out the books that are in here. And you can ask me questions about them." Well, that was just incredible. I mean, what an offer. So basically, he opened his incredible collection of books and manuscripts to me. I was able to enter the vault whenever I wanted. And I had many lunches with him, sitting and just asking him questions about his various books and manuscripts, where he got them, what they meant. And he became a dear friend of mine and of Tamara's. He and Tamara, my girlfriend who became my wife, were very good friends and real pals. And he kind of became like a grandfather to us. And his wife, Marie, was like a grandmother. They would have us over for dinner. They would take us out to a restaurant and their favorite place after work and chat about what we'd been up to. And it was a beautiful, amazing experience.
When did he pass away?
He passed away in the late 90s. We had already left. After 7 years, he called me in and he said that he wanted us to leave because he could see that he was winding up his life, and so were the people that were running the place. And he didn't want a couple of young people like us, because we were still in our early, no, so we were in our mid-20s at that point. And he didn't want us there when chaos broke loose, which it did. So he died about 2 or 3 years after we left, and we didn't really find out until about a year afterwards.
And he was a Freemason. Did he ever try to get you involved in that or anything like that? How did he broach that topic?
Yeah, we talked about it. He had interesting thoughts about it. I also was fortunate. One of the things that he did for me was he allowed me to listen to sit in his secretary's office with an open door and listen to his counseling of various people, which is what led to me being his screener. And he would counsel Freemasons and talk to them about interesting things, usually about how they had achieved enough consciousness that they could die consciously and not swoon into forgetfulness, or just really interesting questions like that. He talked to me about joining Freemasonry. I was kind of interested. I actually got a letter from him that I still have, in which he said that I was a good person and he recommended me. I was proud to get that. But then I found out that there were the way that women were treated. And also, I had a good friend who was his audio engineer and his driver, an amazing guitar player who'd worked for Lena Horne and all kinds of amazing musicians. And his name was Art Johnson, great guitar player. And so he couldn't become a member because he had had polio as a kid and he wore a leg brace, and they weren't allowing people to take membership who couldn't navigate the rituals. And the whole thing just kind of gave me the willies at that point. And I did lecture at several Freemasonic halls, and I found them to be really nice people. I became friendly with a couple people who were 33-degree Masons, who were so different from what one usually thinks of when we hear that. I mean, they were just really down to earth, kind of sweet people, at least the ones that I met. So I thought it seemed like a good thing, but I've always been an outsider in everything I've ever done. I'm just not a joiner. So I disappointed him there, but he didn't care one way or another, really, if I joined or not. He just thought it's a nice way to meet decent people, and you might find it interesting, and you could offer them something, and they could certainly use someone who has your understanding of all of these matters and subjects, because by then I'd become a pretty good lecturer.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about it. My stepdad, who my mom was remarried to, he was in it. He's passed away. I know there's weird stuff, pictures and stuff like that, but I don't know a lot about it. I know a lot of the weird, wacky political sites, like especially on the right side, they seem like they try to demonize it and stuff, like Illuminati, and go crazy about it.
Yeah, no, I'd had that training myself, and so I was suspicious of them. That's why it surprised me. I remember the first time I played one of the first time I lectured at one of their big temples in Los Angeles, and it was just a bunch of really, like a bunch of old guys who were having trouble keeping the place going.
Yeah.
And they were really nice, and I just kind of thought their big thing was to have picnics and be helpful in the community. So, but who knows? I mean, if at the heart of all institutions with a great deal of power, there is some sort of evil always stalking, isn't there?
Yes.
That's a human element to it all.
Exactly.
And so, is this your first book, or have you written books before this?
This is really the first one. I've been involved in books, and like when I went to college, because that's another thing. He wanted me to go get my degree, and so I went and did it. And I had a great professor there who was an expert on Dante and Homer and things like that. So it kind of went well with what I was studying, and so I helped him with a book of essays about the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I found really enlightening. And this is the first, though, that's really my book, and I've been working on it since actually those days with Manly Hall, because it all started in that vault when I handed him a book. And it was this big leather volume, and I picked it up and he was like, "Oh, that's a good one." I remember that. And he said, "Yeah, bring it over here." And I opened it up, and inside it is newspaper, right? Like this is some kind of a newspaper, every issue of it that came out for a couple of years. And it was called The Platonist. And this blew my mind, because this was around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral, and it was coming out of St. Louis, Missouri, at a time when that was still a cattle town, although there was the very beginning of industrialization. And here was this newspaper that somebody created that was translating Plato and the Neoplatonic philosophers. And it had the weirdest thing in it was Abner Doubleday, who was falsely said to have invented baseball. And
Yeah.
he was the first Union general to fire a shot at Fort Sumter to begin the Civil War. He was also a vice president of the Theosophical Society, and he was involved in the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and an all around kind of esoteric guy. And he was the man behind this, and it was in a way part of the New England Transcendentalists. Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott greatly encouraged the Platonist, but I couldn't find out any information back then. I mean, even Manly Hall didn't really know much about these people or how this thing came to be. So one little book had been written in 1962 called The Platonists of the Midwest. It gave some information. Eventually, I just kept studying and pulling on the string, and it just reached so many amazing stories in American history that it turned into this book. And I found out later that this was actually a vital movement in America at one time, where even housewives and people that were just trying to have clubs to do something positive were having Plato clubs, and we're discussing the Platonic dialogues. And these dowagers in the Midwest were studying ancient Greek so that they could read Plato. It's bizarre. And then Yale University was publishing all this Plato stuff, and there were big newspapers and magazines publishing articles about how great Plato was and how he was a kind of a foreshadowing of Christianity. So this deeply infused transcendentalism, but also the spiritualist movement, to such a degree that there are some academics who say that if you look into American metaphysics, you find Plato.
That's pretty interesting.
Definitely.
You always see the pictures. You always see the depictions of the Old West cowboys, where there's always an intellectual amongst them.
Yeah,
It's usually the guy wearing the little derby hat.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I was amazed too that they would like celebrate Plato's birthday and have music and read poems, and they were actually in the Platonist, and I do give a little bit of this in my book. There's actually a description of one of these parties in detail. I love that kind of stuff. So it changed my view of what was going on in America. And as I kept pulling on that string and finding more and more history going back and going forward, I discovered a completely alternate America that had been left out of the history books. And until the 2000s, for the most part, there wasn't much research at all into any of this. If there was, it was generally done by rogue scholars, metaphysicians, and esotericists who were outside academia, like Manly Hall. But in the 2000s, the academics finally caught on and decided that this needed to be studied. It was an influence on history and on America. And so there have been these incredible books and articles and essays written on this subject that have revealed information that we never had before. So that was really exciting to suddenly see all this open and to see how far back this stuff goes, that even the pilgrims who we think of as so strictly Christian were deeply involved in the esoteric.
You know what that reminds me of, the Old West guys? Being obsessed with like Plato and stuff like that. It reminds me of Trekkies. And I guess because there wasn't a franchise coming out every 5 years back then, that was like the closest thing they had to like major cinematic universes. And so they're like dyed in the wool at Plato's birthday, same as J.K. Rowling, all those guys.
Yeah.
So it just sounded like you were describing a Star Trek convention, which is going on just down the road here in Huntsville, William Shatner. So it just kind of reminded me of the same thing. Same people.
Yeah, it is similar. Yeah.
And I know in the intro, a heritage we didn't know we had, and I know it's complex. I know you got into it a little bit, but what else can you tell us about that? I mean, I know there's a lot, but what would you tell us about that?
Sure. It's really exciting. I think that the first thing is what it does is you discover that there's another America, another heritage of people whose approach to life is very different from the official American story. So we often talk about shadows, right? So we say, a lot of people will say, well, America has this shadow because America pretends to be this democracy and it's where everybody's equal and it's supposed to be all about freedom. But the truth is that it's this empire that's been abusing its people and its world. And that's usually the first great awakening, whether a person is a punk rocker or whatever it is that awakens them often as teenagers to the world isn't as I thought it was. That's usually the first step. And I, of course, was deeply indoctrinated into that point of view. And in doing this research, I suddenly discovered that there was a shadow, another shadow for America. And that this shadow, well, I'll give you an example, was typified by somebody who they called the pagan pilgrim. His name was Thomas Morton. And essentially what was going on was when the pilgrims first got out here and they established a colony, back home in England, we had this civil war brewing between the Puritans and what used to be called the Cavaliers or the Royalists. And they were very different kinds of people. The Puritans were very strict. They didn't approve of laughter, or you weren't allowed to drink. You weren't even allowed to run. You were supposed to always walk at a measured pace. Everything was very controlled by the authorities involved in religion. The Cavaliers loved to drink. They loved Shakespeare. They loved bawdy music. They loved women, especially loose women. They're the ones who wore cod pieces, and they usually had crazy hair and beards, and they were just a completely different approach to life. So the Puritans felt that life was a trap. It was dangerous. That Satan was lurking everywhere. And if you just made one wrong move, you'd lose your soul. The Cavaliers treated life like it was a big party. They wanted to laugh and have a great time. And this ultimately led to the Civil War, excuse me, in England. So the Cavalier side saw that the Puritans had sent the Pilgrims out and that they were getting a sort of foothold in this new world. So this man, Thomas Morton, who at that time was 50 years of age, was sent across the Atlantic to establish a trading post to compete with the Pilgrims because their trading post wasn't all that successful. They didn't get along well with the indigenous people, and they had to have a wall around it. And they often suffered from starvation or malnutrition. Well, Tom Morton came out and he found this beautiful, round, green, grassy hill overlooking the Atlantic. And that's where he decided to put his trading post. And he called it Marymount. And it was partially named after Mary. So it was Mary's Mountain. But he also meant Marymount as in a good, having a good time with somebody. And it was also a pun on a Latin, a Latin pun on male genitals. That's the kind of guy he was. So, for instance, he was the first guy to publish a fart joke in America. He was the first guy to have a crazy party closed down in America. He was the first guy to be foreclosed upon by a corporation in America because the Pilgrims were a corporation and they tried to foreclose on him. And so his trading post was a great success. The indigenous people loved him. They didn't need any walls. He treated everybody fairly. He was fascinated with them, their dreams, their religious beliefs. He studied the various kinds of waters and the springs in the area, which the native people said had different qualities, such as some made you sleepy, some made you dream very strongly, some were good for sick people. There was one that bubbled up through crystals. He was fascinated with the beauty of America and the lushness of it. And so he decided to celebrate by having a May Day. And he put up a big yellow pine maypole and they hung ribbons on it. And he wrote this body poem that he had read out loud. And they had music and he invited everybody, pirates, trappers, indigenous people, even the Pilgrims, none of whom showed up. But it was a great party. Everybody got along beautifully. And there was this feeling of unity amid the diversity. And it really threatened the Pilgrims. They described it as a wild party where there was fornication and drunkenness. But Morton said that actually he found that the indigenous women were more moral than the ladies back home in England in general. And so he was trying to say that this community, this trading post that he had developed, could be the future of America, that everyone could get along, that you would all find ways to interact and to support each other. He was selling guns to some of the tribes. He said to help them defend themselves from stronger tribes that were taking advantage of tribes that had been decimated by the diseases brought over by the colonists. And so the Pilgrims said that he was selling the indigenous people guns to use against the Pilgrims. And that's what they went back to claim in the courts in England. And they arrested him several times. They treated him horribly. They tried to starve him to death. They marooned him on an island with almost no supplies. They sent him on the longest possible boat journey home, hoping that he would die. And he didn't. He kept fighting, but ultimately, of course, they won. And he did write about it, and his book is pretty amazing. It gives us such a different view of the Pilgrims, who he describes some very savage actions and also inexplicable things, like when they had him prisoner. It was during winter and they were out of food. They were afraid to go into the wilderness, so he offered to go out and hunt for them, and they made him swear that he would come back, and he did. He got a bunch of food, he brought it back for them, but he didn't bring enough for everybody. He couldn't. So they didn't let the poor eat. And he said, well, let me go out and hunt for them. And they said no. He just couldn't. He's so horrified by that they were willing to let the poor potentially starve rather than let him go out and get food for them. He didn't get it. And he often said that they were surrounded by the most fertile land and animals everywhere, just perfect hunting ground. And they were too frightened of the wilderness and too superstitious about demons and about Satan to even really survive out there. He even tried to teach them how to build better buildings, because they kept building stuff that would basically get rained on and wash away. And he told them, you got to put lime in there. If you put lime in there, it'll resist that, it'll harden. And they didn't believe him because they thought that he was an evil person and that it was some sort of a trick he was trying to pull. He had bad nicknames for them, like Captain Shrimp and such.
What's his name again? What's his name?
Tom Morton.
Okay, Tom Morton.
The Pagan Pilgrim. And he's one of my favorite American characters. And to me, he just sounds so American, right? The fart jokes, the big party, everybody's allowed, everybody come in. And I just think, wow, it's like we could have been celebrating May Day, like with a big maypole. And
oh yeah,
and he's just the beginning of it, because then as you jump forward, you find people like John Winthrop the Younger, who was the son of John Winthrop the Elder, who was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. So when we think about those pilgrims, we think, wow, okay, they are Christian. But here's the weird thing about them. John Winthrop the Younger was actually really into the esoteric. And when he was a young man, he traveled in Europe looking for Rosicrucians. And he was disappointed that he couldn't find anyone that he thought was a real Rosicrucian. So he decided to live his life according to what he thought were the Rosicrucian principles. He was an avid alchemist. And when he moved to America following his father to the colony, he had these big crates full of alchemical equipment, and they were marked with John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, one of the most famous occult symbols. And in fact, he owned a considerable portion of John Dee's library, which was probably the most famous occult library in the United Kingdom at that time. And so in America, eventually John Winthrop moved out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and became the governor of the Connecticut territory. And in that territory, he was famous for being an alchemical doctor. And he actually organized groups of women to diagnose the main illnesses that people were afflicted with in that area. And he gave them these color-coded packets of medicines that he concocted through alchemy, which were said to be very effective. And so what the weirder still is that Cotton Mather, another person that we think of as this very strict Christian who was involved in whole tragedy that occurred in Salem with the witches.
Mm-hmm.
When he wrote a eulogy for John Winthrop the Younger, who was a good friend of his, referred to him as Hermes Christianus, which is to say the Christian Hermes. And whether this is Hermes, the Greek god, or it's Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, who is one of the great philosophical roots of the Western esoteric tradition, it's a very weird thing for a Christian to say, that this person I admired so much was the Christian Hermes, Hermes representing the greatest wisdom of the pagan world. So this was right in the heart of the Pilgrim Society, and was clearly acceptable. I mean, his father didn't disown him or anything like that. And we also see that when, for instance, Harvard and Yale were first made into colleges, were first organized, that they had alchemical labs, and that many of the early presidents were alchemists. And there was one early president of Yale who had run into an itinerant Kabbalah teacher who had traveled around the world and came to the American colonies to check them out, and who taught him quite a bit about Kabbalah. And he was so impressed about it that he gave a speech in which he suggested that all the colleges in America, there were just a handful at the time, should teach Kabbalah. So those are just a couple of examples. And we can go the other way and look at, for instance, the Shakers and the Quakers, who were very early colonists and who brought with them really trance channeling and the attempts to communicate with the dead that became such a big American tradition.
Hey, I was just looking at your book on Amazon, the reviews on it, just reading them. And Don Webb, he was just on my show, Don Webb. I'm friends with Don Webb. I just said, cool. Don Webb, there he is. He was just talking about his newest book. But yeah, your book's great, and I love this kind of information, mostly because it's a lot of stuff I don't know, and then it's unique subject matter that we don't normally have on the show. But maybe once in a while something, like I've done something on Rosicrucians and stuff a little bit, but it's a unique subject matter. And one thing I want to tell you, I want to get into this one. You can talk about whatever you like. We can definitely talk about the Shakers, but I noticed this Thomas Harriot, America's First Evil Genius. So of course that I was like, got to hear that one. But one thing I wanted to tell you, just to give you a summary of why we do this show.
Okay.
And because I think you'll dig it and really understand it, is when I was 17, I've told this story so many times, like, oh, I got to tell it again. I had testicular cancer and had to go through chemo. And I lost one when I woke up from exploratory surgery. So we took one, and you got to go through chemo. And of course, I'm fine now. But that was at 17. A few years later, my dad passed away. So I had that happen, plus my dad passed away. And it was so much on the psyche. I think it was like a shamanic death. Right. I started to have a lot of weird paranormal and UFO experiences, to where I saw native ghosts in my house when I was doing some psychedelic type stuff. There was another time, completely sober, here in Florida in Silver Lake, not even tobacco. I saw two beings of light as if they had been inside my home, and they came out the roof and flew into the heavens. And I was completely sober, and I'd been listening to the Bible on some DVD, playing it to keep creepies away or whatever. I was raised Christian. My dad was a preacher, and I like other stuff too, shamanism. I love Norse stuff and things like that. Like there's so many things like I could shop from that I like. but anyway, I started to have all these weird experiences and UFOs over houses. Now, I don't know if I've ever been taken or abducted. If so, I don't remember a damn thing. But I've had friends go, Jeffrey, you're attracting them here. And every house we moved to, we would see weird stuff. And I don't know what they were, if it was ET phone home or some weird government crap. But my point is, it led to me doing this show. And that there was a time when I was having trouble getting interviews. And I said a prayer and had a weird UFO sighting of some what I call red fireflies in the sky, like some kind of energy. And I screamed like a girl outside. And my brother and nephew ran, and they saw it too. Well, that UFO sighting got me on some radio show through MUFON, which I don't like MUFON anymore. So much weird crap with them. But it led to me doing a radio show. And then I started doing these little audio chats with people in chat rooms where you just type and they can type words. But after that UFO sighting, and I said the prayer that I couldn't get interviews, I was on the phone, next thing you know, with Stanton Friedman, nuclear physicist,
Wow.
and Nick Pope, Nick Redfern, you name it, all these people, Jim Mars, which he's passed. A lot of these are passed away now. But my point is, we did the show, I made the show to raise consciousness, and weird crap happened to me. And, you know, my co-host, they've had, one of them seen a Bigfoot, the other one, wham, she's in with the natives and has weird stuff happen all the time. But that's why we're here. We're following the weird. So
that's so cool.
And your subjects definitely, you know, fit into this, and I'm sure you got your own things as well. But it's great to have you here, and it's a great space to talk about this stuff. But yeah, if you want to talk about the Shakers, and then we can get in that other guy, Bobby can jump in whenever he wants.
Oh yeah, I'm just listening. I'm digging the alternate pilgrim history. That's kind of the crap I like to hear on my podcast, is the different stuff they don't teach in school.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Because I was a history minor, and I did so well because I was just basically listening to some old person tell me a podcast for 3 hours a week. And I'm like, yeah, I can do this. And I think it's kind of like my natural abilities is to listen to the seedy underside of, not seedy so much, but the alternate. The parts you don't hear on the front page of the book.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great skill. It's very needed, I think.
That's what I do. I just find everybody that has these stories. That's my shtick.
Yeah, that's the thing about this my book that is so interesting to me, is that when I first approached it in the process, it seemed to me that we're all doing different things, right? There's people doing shamanism, there's people doing witchcraft, there's people into Norse, there's people into Mayan, there's people into Santa Muerte, and just all kinds of different things. It seemed to each be somewhat fringe, if you will, if you want to use that word. And we generally think of ourselves as off by ourselves in this fringe area. And once I started to compile all this information, I realized that we're not the fringe at all. And that in fact, there are so many similarities in all of these beliefs and practices that they do resemble each other in a way that led academia to describe this stuff as American metaphysical religion. And some of them argue that there is no such thing, that it's just a phrase to encompass a bunch of superstitions that don't fit in traditional history books. But others argue that it is a real thing, and that it may be the American religion, which is slowly evolving. So, for example, one of the things I argue in my book is that American Christianity is very different from traditional Christianity. And in many ways, it resembles American metaphysical religion more than it resembles Christianity. So, for example, in traditional Christianity, you didn't want to be a rich man because you wouldn't get into heaven. You figured that this world was going to be full of suffering, and you were very likely damned, even if you did live a pretty good life, because that was just the nature of sin. And in America, partially, I think, thanks to the pursuit of happiness, it's turned into something completely different, where Christianity is telling many people that they should be wealthy, that God wants them to be happy and successful, and that this world should be lifted up into a heavenly paradise, not feared as a trap. And so I think the Shakers and the Quakers are an example of that, because here we have Christians who, again, we think of as being fairly traditional, but the truth is that in the very early colonial days, they were into all kinds of interesting things. And both in England and America, for example, there were Quakers who took the story of Lazarus very literally, and they would try to dig up and resurrect their dead because it's in the Bible. You know, we should be able to do it.
Necromancy.
Exactly.
That's reading. That's called reading it wrong. There, that's not what happened at all.
Yeah, exactly. And then the Shakers had a famous incident very early in American history where some of their young women heard heavenly music, and they fell into trance, and they were called sleeping prophets, just like Edgar Cayce was called the sleeping prophet in the 20s and 30s. And so this kind of spiritualist interest in communicating with the dead, or having information that's provided from spiritual sources, has been a American preoccupation since very early on. Now, Thomas Harriot, the evil genius, kind of an ironic title for him, he was part of Walter Raleigh's circle and was part of something that Raleigh had called the School of Night. And Raleigh was the classic cavalier. They loved to get together and drink. They loved to experiment with alchemy. They had passionate love relationships, and they were always scheming on how to bring England around to what they wanted. And Raleigh got in trouble because he actually was part of a scheme to get rid of King James and his family, which put an end to Heriot's activities eventually. But in the time that we first find Heriot, he was Raleigh's scientist. He was an alchemist, but he was also somebody who designed tremendous navigational tools. They say, is the one who's probably most responsible from turning the British Navy from what it was originally, which was very ineffective, into this feared kind of semi-pirate, modern for those days, fleet. And he had new principles of navigation. He was also one of the first people to build a telescope in England, and one of the first people anywhere to do a drawing of what he could see of the moon's surface. And he also revolutionized plumbing and came up with some of the theories about how plumbing should function, as far as how fast water goes through the pipes. And everywhere he went, he just came up with these brilliant inventions, trying to improve life on a practical level, but also just seeking the mysteries of nature. So when Raleigh wanted to create this colony in Virginia, he sent over Heriot. And Heriot, this amazing thing is that archaeologists actually found pieces of broken alchemical alembics and of the kind of stuff that would be found inside them from cooking up alchemical recipes in America near that Virginia colony on a beach. And they're relatively sure that this was Thomas Heriot's stuff. And while he was here, he was collecting this amazing, basically a museum, it would have been, of specimens, everything from these giant pearls that he had found that he was going to present as a necklace to Queen Elizabeth. This was prior to the days of James. And he was bringing home samples of animals and plant life. And he wrote a book in which he described America. And in one way, it's a really ugly book, because it's the first kind of corporate exploitative business plan for America. And he uses this phrase over and over again: we took it and we ate it. And they ate some weird animals and some weird stuff that, like, people generally don't eat. But he would describe something and say, oh, they have these huge otters and we took it and we ate it. And so you can't help but read it and think, well, here it is. Here is the future of America arriving in the person of this fellow. And he's trying to convince England back home to spend a lot of money on this, because we can really use all these resources and just exploit them. He also, however, was sensitive enough to realize that the indigenous people were in some ways living a superior lifestyle in harmony with nature, that their senses were superior. He pointed out, for example, that he knew one native who could see a ship out at sea a mile further than any person that he had come with from Europe. And he pointed out that they had great family lives, that they treated the elderly well, that they were very kind to their children, and that they didn't need to have walls and police, because they shared everything. And so he wondered, maybe this is in some ways a better lifestyle. And even wondering that was a really bad idea in those days. When he came back to America, bringing tobacco with him, by the way, and Raleigh was a big tobacco smoker, and so was Thomas Heriot. And so they all got together in Walter Raleigh's beautiful mansion on the Thames, and they were inventing things and trying to figure out what the native languages were and how to take indigenous words and put them into English writing, and just really a kind of hotbed of experimentation and thought. But the problem was that around them were religious fanatics, and eventually there were attacks on Raleigh and on the School of Night based on accusations about things like, oh, you know what they did? They rolled up tobacco in pages of the Bible. Or Walter Raleigh said that he thought that the miracles that Thomas Harriot were capable of were better than anything that Moses did in the Bible. This was just loudmouth, cavalier, drunken, joking, and talking. But these were terrible, sinful things to say, satanic things to say to the authorities. And so they wound up putting the bunch of them into the Tower. And obviously Raleigh was eventually beheaded, but more because he'd become involved in this plot against James. Harriot was under the protection of a guy who was called the Wizard Earl, and who was very deeply interested in esoteric ideas, and so Harriot lived with him under his protection for a little while, helping out with plumbing and things like that, and helping him with his alchemical and astronomical experiments, and helping him with his studies of the esoteric. And then they came after Harriot, and they put him on trial and accused him of being an evil genius. And so Harriot was really, we have all kinds of records of his library and what he was reading near the end of his life. And he was a very sincere but skeptical Christian. He wanted to read everything and to come to his own conclusions. And he had arguments, and he got in trouble, by the way, for this. One of the things that he said was, well, I don't see any way that an angel could communicate with a human being, because they don't have the same apparatus that we do. They don't have, how will we apprehend them? We don't have the senses for that. It doesn't make sense to me scientifically. Well, that was a very bad thing to say. Unfortunately for him, I don't know which, he developed skin cancer basically on his nose, and people made fun of it. They said, that's what he gets for putting his nose into things that God didn't intend for us to understand. And he died from that. And so he was actually somewhat forgotten. And to this day, there are huge piles of paper in museums in England and collections that have never been collated or examined of his work. And some of it was recently looked at, and they found that his mathematics was so advanced that the people that had published some of his work later had messed it up. And they saw that he had actually provided some of the first steps in terms of binary numbers that would lead to computer science. So he was brilliant. I say in the book that he was like a Silicon Valley guy, like this incredible inventor, programmer, tech wizard who was born way too early.
Definitely very interesting for sure.
I've heard the story of the nose cancer before. That I remember. I've heard that from listening to the alternative history shows, last podcast on the left and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
stuff's just coming back to me that you're saying. I'm like, I've heard this before.
Yeah.
I get buried in that kind of information. I hear all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I do too. I'm already found things that, well, there were so many more things that could be put in the book, unfortunately, and we had to choose because the book is huge. It's already 600 pages, and of course, since then, I keep finding things that I wish I could put in the book. So it's a never-ending process of discovery.
When I first read Evil Genius, I thought of H.H. Holmes, which I wish I didn't do that. He gives me creeps. So we've done shows on H.H. Holmes, and when I hear Evil Genius, he tries to haunt me. But we had Jeff Mudgett on, who's related to him somehow.
Oh wow!
But what about those Shakers? And of course, I always think of that movie, The Witch, when we talk about pilgrims and stuff. I'm not even sure if they were pilgrims. They're Protestant. That movie, The Witch. I don't know if you ever saw that, by Eggers, with the Black Phillip and all that stuff. The witches.
Yeah.
Were they Protestant or I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. The whole Salem thing. First, James was very responsible for the witch scares. When he was King of Scotland, he wrote a book and he passed a law in which he encouraged people to be afraid of witches, and he blamed there was a small fleet of his ships that were sunk, and he didn't want to look like he was a king that was either not, didn't have God's grace on him, or that he was somehow inept. So he blamed it on witches. Witches had sent a wind to cause his ships to sink. And this directly led to witch persecutions in Europe and ultimately in the New World. And Salem itself, which is such an interesting laboratory for studying this phenomenon, what you find is if there was anybody there was practicing anything, it was probably a woman who came from the Caribbean who was a servant, essentially a enslaved person, and she had some Afro-Caribbean practices. They found like her little puppet doll and things like that. And as is sometimes the case when women like that are being the nannies for children, they will share some of this stuff in ways with the children that they are taking care of. And that's certainly where some of this came from. The people that were there were traditional Puritan Protestants, which means they were neurotic to begin with, because they were nervous about nature. They were nervous about everything, what they were doing. And they had a church authority that was, even though it was Protestant and it wasn't as severe as the Catholic Church, which at its height was the world's greatest surveillance program, right? Because every confessional was linked to the Pope. So if there was important information the church needed to know, it was probably going to hear it in the confessional. The Protestants didn't have confessionals, but they had very strong pastors and ministers who were very involved in everything going on in the community. And the academic studies of it seem to indicate that this was less about religious beliefs and more about socioeconomic status and gender. That the women who got in trouble were the women who either just didn't fit in, like women who had personalities that were a little strange and who would be antisocial, or women who were widows who had money and weren't doing enough in the eyes of the community to help the community with that money. So they were considered to be a waste of energy in a sense. And so they were the most likely people to be attacked, those two kinds of people. And it seems that a lot of the attacking, on one hand, there was the superstition, the fear of an old woman who might raise her fist at you and say something to you because she doesn't want you on her land. But on the other side, there was a lot of money being taken from these people and redistributed into the Salem community. So it had different causes behind it, and the spiritual side of it, I don't know if it was really that big. And it's funny to see somebody like Cotton Mather, for example, who starts out as a strong voice against witches and then winds up deciding that the trials were wrong. And the one time that he deals with a witch after that, he brings her into his house to try to personally save her soul by making her part of his household and having her eat at the table with his family, and very different approach. So I think that what you're seeing is a combination of the panic that many pilgrims felt being in the New World, because just imagine sitting there in your little, your little hut basically, and there's an entire continent going all the way, thousands of miles to the west and to the north and to the south, and it's filled with indigenous people who are considered to be satanic, and you are this tiny little enclave of Christians in the midst of all this chaos. So they were very nervous people.
And bears.
Yes. Yeah.
That's when everything was still running around. Now let me ask you this about Salem. How long did the trials actually last? It wasn't long, was it?
No, it was just a couple of years that it drifted through.
Didn't they kind of come to their senses like right after that, and like, we're going to push this under the rug? But they brought it back. They brought it back in the mid. They realized they can make some money off of it.
Yeah.
So they brought it back in middle like 1960.
Right.
I've been really disappointed in what I've heard about Salem lately doing this show. I'm like, I thought it was like a lore brought up, maybe not as maybe not literal witches, but with what's her name, Hechuba, the little
Yes,
voodoo
that's her.
queen, and I figure maybe a little paranoia with the voodoo being there, and
Yep.
probably somebody slept with somebody's kid. It always happens. Something to that effect. They slept with a teenager, not a child, but
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
then they brought it. They swept it under the rug. Huge scandal. Then they realized they could get people come in there about
Also,
1960.
also consider the power of that those young women, the
Mm-hmm.
accusers, the power they suddenly had, right? That
Oh
must have been
yeah.
for an adolescent girl driven by her hormones in a society where she was nothing until she was married, and then she wasn't very much. It must have been pretty powerful feeling to be able to accuse people and be the center of the court and do all these dramatic acting outs, and it was a show.
Look at the Me Too movement. Same shit. Like, oh look, I have power. You believe me? I'm the authority now. Like
Right.
Captain Phillips.
It's
I'm the
it,
captain now.
right. Well, it's the human. We have this tendency to try to overcompensate, and we
Mm-hmm.
also have a tendency to provoke the opposite of what we're trying to do. And so you see this all the time in American politics and the polarization of it. And you would think that by now they would figure out that when either side goes to an extreme, all they do is invoke the extreme from the other side
Mm-hmm.
and to
Doesn't
try
help
to
at all.
find, yeah,
Like the old saying, if you attract what you fear, and if you
yes,
face something, it goes away.
yes,
I use that a lot in my life. Something starts freaking me out. I'm like, I get that anxiety. I just actually turn toward it and kind of just try to work it out, and it usually disappears in like 15 minutes.
right.
Some stupid issue at work or something I'm dreading.
Oh, yeah. I know what
Yeah,
you're talking about. Yeah, I call that whack-a-mole.
yeah. You turn toward it and I just start shotgun blasting emails. Whoever can help me with it,
Yeah,
start anything I can do just to cover it up, and it usually goes away and it's nothing. And
exactly.
ruin my weekend for nothing. So
Oh, yeah, yeah. No,
it's the same principle.
that's a common human predicament for all of us.
Yep. Worrying doesn't help, and that's like my greatest trait is my ability to worry. It's my best characteristic.
I saw one of the reviewers on Amazon was asking you, is everything a carnival deception? Is everything a carnival deception?
Oh, wow.
Not everything, I'm sure, but a lot of
Well, I mean, there's several answers to that question. The first one would be yes, in the sense that it's all some great mystery that we're all involved in, and we don't quite know what's going on. We're trying to make sense out of it the best we can with language, and we're never really sure that we have made sense out of it. So in a way, it kind of all is, and if you use the word Maya, right, from the Eastern tradition, that it's all just this kind of magnificent illusion in which we try to learn. And so from that point of view, I would say maybe it is all a carnival deception. I don't know why that person thought that I thought that. I think that they took my humor as being cynical, because actually I find it all amazing, and I find wisdom in all of it. And one of the things that I point out in the book is that even among the frauds, and there were plenty of them that I talk about in the book, there were some brilliant ideas and some influence that they had that may have been a really positive influence on their time or on the future. And then the ones who didn't appear to have any fraud, they were just held up as these paragons of excellence. They tended to have clay feet too, and often the ones who meant the best did things that caused a lot of bad things to happen. So as I saw all this history forming together and how it rolled out like these in streams and rivulets and rivers out into the centuries of the American experience, I kind of fell in love with all of it, and I felt like it's all this beautiful, amazing display of experimentation and wisdom and also foolishness. But even within foolishness, there's learning, right? So sometimes being foolish is the best way to approach learning, to realize that we're ignorant. And in the Western tradition, particularly, we have the tradition of the founder of the Rosicrucians, the alleged founder, Christian Rosenkreutz, echoing Socrates, saying that, well, the only thing I really know is that I don't know anything. And that's a good baseline, right? I think. But I think that the book shows, I mean, there isn't anybody who gets away unscathed. I feel like so far I've been very fortunate that I haven't gotten more criticism, because all these lionized leaders were just human beings. And I do tell stories about them that maybe people who want to hold them up as somehow symbols of perfection take offense at or don't want to believe. But to me, that doesn't affect the wisdom. And let me give you an example of that. So there's a guy whose name was Phineas Quimby, and he was the father, in a sense, or even let's call him the grandfather of the mind cure and of new thought, and the whole movement ultimately culminating in Christian Science. And Mary Baker Eddy was actually one of his patients and learned everything that she put into Christian Science from Quimby. Well, Quimby was an uneducated guy, just a country kind of person who had this epiphany involving his belief in Christ, which was that if you truly believe, then you can be healed. And the way you are healed is you have to be talked out of your belief in your illness. So an example of that would be somebody that he talked about who had a heart problem, a diagnosed heart problem. And he approached the guy and he said, well, when did this start? And the guy said, well, I was grasping at my breast pocket for my wallet and it wasn't there, and there had been a bunch of money in it. And then that's the first time I ever felt a pain in that area. And then he said, so then you went to a doctor and the doctor did tests and he decided that something was wrong with you and he scared you and he gave you medicines, and you thought about it all the time and your whole family talked about it. And soon there was nothing but trying to organize how to live your life around this problem. And the guy was like, yes. And he said, it's all false. Before the light of Christ, it's all just shadows that stream away. And when he got to them, when he somehow reached into their souls with his words, there would be these spontaneous healings. And there were thousands of testimonials preserved. So he was held up as this figure of great purity, as this wonderful father figure of gentleness and of love for people. And then academia stuck its nose in there, and they discovered some disturbing things about this guy. One was that he really was famous for how he cussed. And the idea that he was this person who never thought anything bad was belied by people who left witness accounts of him cussing like what we would now say, cussing like a truck driver or like a Marine. And he was also credited for writing these books that became the Quimby manuscripts, is what they were called, but he couldn't write. And it seems that probably his faithful secretary actually wrote all the things that were ascribed to him. And maybe most disturbing, he not only tried to talk some of the more attractive women patients out of their the symptoms of their diseases, but he tried to talk them out of their corsets too. And there were situations where there were records of him having been very aggressive with women when he got alone with them. And so all that had been covered up by his followers. Now, having said that, he still had some brilliant ideas that make people think, and we may not go all the way to where Mary Baker Eddy went with it, but we can look at, for example, this one idea, this a wonderful saying he had, which was, he said that health is how the body experiences the eternity of the soul. That's a nice subject for meditation.
It is. It's like just complicated enough you can't think about it in one thought.
Exactly. And it captures the American preoccupation with mind cures, with being able to think or feel or somehow spiritually overcome sickness. Because the idea is, in this tradition, that if your soul is fully seated in your body, if your soul is 100% free in your body, then you will be healthy. And if you are unhealthy, it's because there are some kind of blockages that are coming in from things you've learned or bad habits or beliefs or emotions that you're having. They're not allowing your soul to properly command your body. And so this goes back to shamanism, right? This is the idea that if there's something wrong, it's because there's a blockage of some kind that might be caused by a spirit or by some evil action, and then you have to do something to clear that away. And so that's another strong tradition. But I like to use Quimby as an example of, he still had some really interesting ideas and some powerful kind of meditations that people can benefit from. But he wasn't a great guy. And I'm not sure that it matters whether he was a great guy or not. So going back to the question, I don't really think I don't think they're all frauds. I think there's a little fraud in everybody. I don't think any human being is completely free of some sort of self-interest or other qualities that maybe get in the way of being this paragon of spirituality. But on the other hand, I also think that all of them have worthwhile aspects. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book, was not just to tell their stories, including the darker side, but also there's a lot of quotes in it from people. There's just stuff, gems, that you would find. I'd be doing research and I'd find somebody said something and I would just go, wow, that's great. Okay, so let's make sure that's in the book so we can appreciate that this person came up with this great idea. And so there's a whole bunch of examples of people daring to live very independent lives, especially in a spiritual way, and a whole bunch of examples of different approaches to these subjects that cover almost any way you can imagine of wanting to experience spirituality, from the most alienated and dark to the most loving and light-filled. And it's like Americans have tried it all in our history. And yet most of us, I mean, I know when I was growing up, I always thought that you really didn't have any choices. I mean, it was monotheism. It was either, you either were Christian or Jewish or Muslim, or you had to go with the other side and go satanic or something, because what else was there? And the truth is that there is a world of possibilities out there, and America has been a laboratory for that.
And I understand what you mean about the dark side. My dad died. I've read a lot of those kind of books, Ant on the Bay and stuff. I never practiced it, but I read them. And then I got paranoid that I had the book and got rid of it. And then, I just had a Satanist on and interviewed him recently. He's an old co-host of mine, nicest guy ever. But I always jokingly say, even though I don't like Geraldo Rivera, I tell him I go into Geraldo Rivera mode when I interview Satanists. It's like I have this choir boy, schoolboy Christian that's doing it, like, oh, Satanist, oh. But it's always fun. I try to ask them tough questions, but I've read that stuff. I mean, I remember being zonked out on drugs and screaming from that Simon paperback Necronomicon on Halloween night in a cemetery. So it was like, And we've had Peter Levendal that supposedly has weird connections with that book. Supposedly was one of those in that collective and stuff. So definitely. I know you were talking about the Shakers, and how did they get caught up in some weird, like, what kind of paranormal stuff? Like, what did you say,
it was just
something?
It was just the most famous incident was these girls just out of nowhere started saying they were hearing heavenly music in the sky. They were outside, and they just kept saying, "Do you hear that? Do you hear that music? It's so beautiful." And the adults weren't hearing it, and the girls said it's getting louder, and then they passed out. So they were taken to their beds, and there they began to prophesy. And they were essentially talking to the community about the community's problems and giving guidance and relaying information from members of the community that had passed on. So it was really just the kind of mediumship that we have here now, but it originated in this mysterious music that these girls heard. And that's the weird thing about the spiritualist tradition in America, because the Fox sisters, who really are the ones who made it famous in the 1800s, just a couple of really uneducated girls from a relatively poor family who started to have this manifestation of knocks around them. People would say they were loud knocks at the ceiling, under the floor, behind walls. And then they noticed that they could ask questions and get them answered by one or two knocks. And then it became even more complicated. And this is really what exploded into a worldwide fad with table tipping and ectoplasm and a lot of fraud.
Oh, yeah.
And so
they would hide it up their vaginas, the cheesecloth.
Yes, that's one of the things they did. Yeah, and
that fucked me up first time I heard that.
And because of that, by the way, a lot of those spiritualists, like the Witch of Lime Street, were also kind of like, it was a peep show, right? Because they would say, now you'll see, I'm not hiding anything. They would just wear like a really sheer robe, and you could see them naked. Well, that was a big thrill for some, guy that had the money to go see a medium. It was basically a way of going to a strip bar at a time when there weren't any.
Hey, Harry Houdini shut that shit down.
Yeah, he did a lot of work. He was very passionate about it. And it's funny because to such a degree, one of the things that I found was when he went after the Witch of Lime Street, who was really a tragic case in a way.
Yeah. Did she kill herself?
She basically drank herself to death.
Yeah.
She was somebody who was manipulated by her husband. It was an older man who was a doctor, and he seemed to have a combination of a real enthusiasm for spiritualism, but he also seemed to be into weird sex, and he was kind of a cuckold, I guess. And so they would hook up with like reporters and important people who would give these glowing reviews in the newspapers or in these scientific studies about the Witch of Lime Street. And there are some records of this is the weird thing about spiritualism, is that some of the frauds will produce real phenomenon here and there. And some of the people who really were apparently doing sincere psychic readings that seemed to have some kind of relevance would wind up being frauds in order to keep supporting what they were doing because their talent was starting to flag or something. And so you keep finding in the world of spiritualism this combination of terrible criminality. Like back in the day, there was a whole organized mob, and I mean, even in the mid 20th century, there was one guy who outed a bunch of the mediums and was talking about how they had books in which they had like all the local obituaries, and they would share information about clients and set up clients to be fleeced by another psychic. And when he wrote a book about that, he got shot at, and then he like moved across the country and he got shot at again. And he was saying that there's a lot of organized crime behind spiritualism at that time in America because there was so much money in it. And so now, having said that, Manly Hall wasn't really into psychic stuff. He warned most of his followers to stay away from mediums. He was friends with Hugh Lynn Casey, Edgar Casey's kid, and he respected Casey, but he wasn't very interested in that kind of activity. And I was approached while I worked for him by somebody who wanted to meet him, who had a friend who was a psychic, and he offered me a free reading to prove how good the guy was, and I didn't have to go there or anything, to stay at home. And wow, man, I write about this guy, Edward A. Monroe. He was unbelievable, and his following were mostly retired Christian people in the Sun Belt, older people. And he himself was a Christian, and he had been a LAPD sergeant working in the motor pool as a mechanic, and didn't become a medium until he was in his 70s after he prayed to be made use of in some way. And it all happened, bass-ackwards. He wasn't, he was dragged kicking into what he did, but he was amazing. His medical stuff, for example, I personally witnessed some things that he did that were just tremendous. He could tell people about things about themselves that no one knew, including he did that to me once. And so there were real people. There are people out there who have these skills, but they're very rare, and they tend to be very quiet and not that easy to find. Whereas the ones who become very famous tend to get involved in the fraud because they have so much to lose, right?
Like you were saying, the old mediums were like a peep show. Well, now I've discovered since doing this show, the more attractive the medium, the more full of shit they are. Because that's part of their siren pull you in. And I noticed you said that people in the paranormal community, they would get a little bit of validity, and then they'd have to go fake the rest of it. You see a ton of that with UFO people and Bigfoot people. They get one good 5-second, best footage in the world, and they get that fame, and then they have to fake the rest of it.
That's the thing. Yeah, it's terrible. It's partly, I think, because of the way that everything is driven by media, and you want people to write about you. You want people to talk about you. Otherwise, you disappear. And so there's this effort to find things that will be talked about. And it's also, I always think of the story of Paschal Beverly Randolph, who was one of the principal Rosicrucians, and in America. He was a man of several races, but basically looked black. And when he first started out, he was brilliant in the spiritualist community. He had all these theories, and he was giving lectures, but people didn't really pay attention to him. And then he decided to claim that he had been taught by the Rosicrucians, and he presented the same teachings, having lied about the Rosicrucians, and suddenly he was an influential, important person. And
nobody
so,
checks it.
yeah. And then later in life, he admitted it. He said that those were all my ideas. I didn't get them from anybody else. And he was a big influence on the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and also on the Rosicrucian orders within America, like Amorc and such. So always, when I think about that, so I think about him, because I think it's the pressure, that I have these good ideas. No one's paying attention. How am I going? Okay, well, screw it then. I'm a Rosicrucian. I went to Europe, and the Rosicrucians, they initiated me, and now what I'm teaching you are the secrets of the Rosicrucian masters. Oh, well, why didn't you say so in the first place? Right?
It's a horse of a different color.
Exactly.
I was showing you that that Spotify podcast. It has a whole. It's called Mediums. It's just called Mediums. It's got a crystal ball on Spotify, but it's all about those what's her name? The Witch of Lime Street. Whole episode about her. Talks about Houdini just going on a warpath, just trying to shut them all down.
Yeah, and he committed fraud. He was trying so hard to shut down the Witch of Lime Street. His assistant later admitted that he had tried to trick her when he couldn't catch her. Yeah, it's amazing.
Tried everything.
Yeah, they just they lose control, and it's fascinating to me how you can see these interactions. How it's so much of it is pressure, I guess, just for survival. Because when you go out and you try to present yourself as a metaphysical teacher and make your living that way, man, that is some heavy pressure. And I even remember when I used to lecture for Manly Hall, that I knew the things I wanted to lecture about were one thing, but what the audience wanted to hear was something else. And you felt pressure from people around you, please the audience, talk about what they want to talk about. And I actually talked to Manly Hall about that. And he agreed. He said that he would rather talk about deeply intellectual subjects like the Neoplatonists and Buddhism and get into deep ideas, but that really wasn't what was required by the people that he was there to help. He felt that what they needed was practical advice about how to improve their lives, that he was able to distill from these more complicated traditions. And he did a wonderful job. I mean, the community that he had around him was beautiful, but it was a little disappointing for him because he couldn't do what he did in the early days when he used to do these little kind of conferences for just a few people where he went deep into this stuff. And that's a constant pressure. And I think with social media, that's probably aggravated quite a bit for people. So you see so many people are out there, young people in particular, trying to present themselves as teachers. And as you said, not only in the world of mediums, but there's a lot of sexuality in the worlds of paganism and witchcraft where the girls are presenting themselves. It's funny. It almost reminds me, since I come from the world of music, it reminds me of the old world of groupies almost, the way they dressed and stuff. And it's cool in a way because it's for them now. It's at least they're trying to make money off it, but it's not just to go serve some, fake ass rock star or something, but still it's a strange pressure to put on spirituality. And if you've been in this a long time, it takes a long time to really learn your way around this stuff. And we never really finish. It's something that we're always doing, is learning. But some of the most ineffable experiences involved in spirituality escape words. And there are so many people. I just saw a guy the other day a pretty famous writer, I won't out him, who got well known writing about things like psychedelics and altered states of consciousness and the relation to the Mayans and things like that. And he's like, he got really into the occult, and he's doing this big workshop for people. And he said, "Oh, I've just read all these books," and he listed all these books that he's read in the last couple months to do this thing. And I just thought, wow, that's nice. You can share the information that you read, but you got to live this stuff. To really be able to share something, you got to live it. You can't
Almost
just
sounded
read
like
about it.
almost sounded like old backcountry guy. What was his name?
That's Hunter S. Thompson. He's
Gonzo. It almost sounded like you're talking about him for a minute.
You made me think of someone, but I'm not going to say their name. Last name starts with a P, but I'm not going to say it. I could be wrong, but that may be it. But I know he does the Mayan stuff. It doesn't matter. But one that disappointed me, a teacher that was kind of cool that I found out was kind of a jerk, was Carlos Castaneda. Did you ever come across any of that? There's a book called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I interviewed her. Was it Amy Wallace, Irvin Wallace's daughter? I interviewed her about all that abuse, and I found out about him through Wayne Dyer. Reading about Carlos Castaneda, which Wayne Dyer passed. That still pisses me off. As much as he railed against that stuff, that really sucked. But
there's an amazing book coming out, by the way, called, I think this year, called American Trickster. That UCLA's putting out. That finally is going to reveal all the detail about the fraud and what was really going on with him. But he's another good example of that, because despite that, I talked to so many people whose lives were positively changed by his writing, even though most of it was made up. I mean, once the anthropologists really got into the Yaqui culture, they found that what Castaneda was writing about wasn't part of Yaqui culture. So did he invent it? Was it a combination of things? No one really knows. But despite that, I still run into people who have been deeply influenced by him. And even though they know now that he was a fraud, they say, but I learned so much from those books. So it's really interesting.
Good. That's what's so crazy. They were great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Robert Marshall is the guy I believe you're talking about doing the Castaneda's Sinister Legacy. I found something about. I was trying to find
that. That is correct. Yeah. It's now Roberta Marshall, I believe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it has an A like in a little. Okay, I got you.
Yeah. And that's going to be a great book, man. I've seen some little bits in here and there of things he's written, and I think it's going to be just great. And I think that also the whole idea of the American trickster is so much the American tradition. I think my book is filled with American tricksters, and you never know what they're going to do next.
I freaking love Coyote and all that stuff. I get into that. I love it. Those folklore, anything that trickster, love it. Love it.
Yeah, and those experiences are so inexplicable. I'll tell you, for example, my coyote story. I've always had a thing with them. I grew up in an area where there were a lot of coyotes, and there was a lot of trouble between people and coyotes, but they always were really cool with me. Rattlesnakes were always really cool with me too. And I could always go right by their territories, and we just kind of look at each other, hey, and it was no problem. And I later became friends with John Trudell, who was a great indigenous poet and an activist. He was part of the American Indian movement occupation of Alcatraz back in the day in the 60s, 70s. And he was I was working on a script, because sometimes I would script doctor, and I was working on a script about, it's not worth going into, but let's say there was a character in it whose name was going to be Coyote, and the director wanted John to play Coyote. And he was really into it. He loved Coyote. So I thought that was great. And we became friends. We had some incredible discussions. The guy was a genius. I mean, he's brilliant about what's going on in the world and how to kind of, just to give you one brief example, he used to always say that everything that's thrown at us is made to make us afraid or angry, and it's made to stop us from having clarity. And that the only way that we're going to get out of this mess that we're all in is by learning to think clearly again, is having clarity about what's important to us in our lives and our communities. But anyway, John got sick, and when he passed, every day for a week, and I mean, they'd never come around here. Every day for a week, a huge pack of coyotes came right into my yard. And they would just yap and howl and run around and go nuts for a few minutes, and then they would disappear. And I would just laugh and say, wow, is this John? What's going on here? And the funny thing is that it would come up later. Like, I just had a recent experience where he came up in conversation. I was talking about him, and that night, 3 coyotes came screaming up our driveway. And we don't have a garage, we have a carport. And one of them jumped up on the top roof of the carport and then stood there like F of the mountain, and like looking over everything with his big ears out, and like he owned the place. And it was just a funny coincidence, you know. You tell that to your indigenous friends, and they're like, well, yeah, you know.
Clearly.
I've listened to John before. He has like a CD where he speaks and like chanting.
Yeah.
The Navajo would be like, well, yeah, that's your friend. Why would you even think it wasn't?
Yeah, no, I love them. I think they're wonderful, and they're kind of, the funny thing about these guys is that they've sort of taken over all the hillsides around here. And
where are you at?
I live near Laurel Canyon.
What state was it? You?
California.
California, okay.
Yeah, and we got a lot of them in SoCal, and there's big packs of them out here. And you know, we had, I don't know if you heard about, we had P-22. We had this puma that was like the official cat of Los Angeles.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that roaming around the city.
It was a trip. He was everywhere, and we have pictures of him, for example, like lounging on just a suburban street next to a motorcycle that I guess he thought was cool. And people fell in love with him. It was very funny when he passed, which wasn't funny. But when he passed, the whole city went into mourning. I couldn't believe it. It was really strange how much he meant to everybody. And he's on murals all over the place in town now.
Yeah, for some reason that just unlocked a core memory. I think I got obsessed with that for a day or two. I think I started following him really heavy for like a week back when it was going down.
He was a beautiful cat, really gorgeous, and survived crossing freeways to get here, and set himself up in Griffith Park, which is where Manly Hall set himself up too. And it was nice too, because, you know, when he passed, at first they were going to stuff him and put him in the museum, and then they were going to do a big monument, but they actually let the local indigenous tribes do a private, secret burial using their ceremonies.
That makes more sense than the taxidermy.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird.
I know, right? Yeah.
I saw that weird. I saw a cocaine bear, and it's
I want to see that.
But it's worth one watch. But there's over the top gore, which I can handle, but I kind of like mine more subtle. But that's like those Terrifier clown movies. Those are over the top, but I like them. But sometimes I'm like, I don't think I'm ever going to watch that one again. But it was really, I liked it the first time, but it's just too much. But
it reminded me a little of Sharknado.
But
exactly.
There's a little documentary on Peacock that you can watch about the cocaine bear, like a documentary, the real story.
Oh.
Cocaine bear didn't kill anyone. He just did 4 grams of coke and croaked from some crazy bastard.
That's no.
It happened right where you were raised.
Yeah, in Georgia. That's where I'm from. Bud Mountain and all that stuff. Yeah. But anyway, Cocaine Bear never really killed anyone. He just got a hold of the shit and croaked. But in the movie, he's killing everybody. So
it was such a good
Cocaine Bear.
It's such a train wreck.
It's fun to watch, though.
I like train wreck movies.
Ray Liotta's last movie, so that's
But the pilot really did land in Knoxville in somebody's driveway.
It's crazy. Wow. If you got Peacock, watch Cocaine Bear, and then
flew right over the Smoky Mountains.
That's an hour after it. That dude was nuts, dropping all that coke out and
that's like an hour from here.
Plane crash.
Wow.
So there may have been some wrongdoing or something.
That's
It's a fun watch. It's worth the watch for sure.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
Definitely.
It was. I found it on my bootleg site, so I fired it up.
Gruesome.
Nice.
Gruesome though. So doing all this stuff, do you ever have any weird paranormal, anything? UFOs, ghosts?
Yeah,
anything?
I've had some.
What's your Goldie Oldies? That's what I call mine, the good ones.
You know, the one that that really got me, because, as I said, I was raised by atheists, so I didn't really. It was hard, man. I was working for Manly Hall, but I wasn't believing in a lot. Like, for example, I thought astrology was just completely ridiculous, and he was an astrologer. And at one point, I actually said to him, "Do you really believe in this? A smart guy like you?" I mean, he thought that was very amusing. And he said, "I tell you what, you don't know enough about it, so I'm going to introduce you to an astrologer that I respect, and she'll teach you the basics, and then you and I can debate it. But at least you'll know enough." But she blew my mind, and after that I didn't debate him because I didn't think there was any reason to. It obviously had something to it. But the thing that got me was that my father, who was just a through and through atheist and a materialist, a very ethical man, but just didn't believe in any of that stuff. And he was one of those dads that I was into music and all kinds of stuff, and I loved the imagination. As a kid, I'd gotten into William Blake, and I just loved the idea that the imagination was this powerful force that human beings had. And my dad was from a generation where the imagination was a word like effeminate, right, or gay, or it was just if you were using your imagination, you were not a man. Men
It's
don't
like Hank Hill.
right,
My
exactly.
dad too. If you cry, you're gay. That's my dad.
Nah,
Fine.
that's true though. That's not entirely false.
So we used to get into it about that stuff because I was devoting my life to, even though I was this dark figure and into criminal activity, I was devoting my life to music and to creativity, and he thought I was throwing my life away. So we would argue viciously about it, and he would always had this saying, which was, "I don't have that kind of imagination." So later, when I became into the spiritual stuff, and I actually had a near-death experience, which is another thing that was powerful. I tried to tell him, because he was very sick and he had a long, slow decline, and I was trying to tell him about these experiences I had and about the beliefs around it, and he would always say, "Yeah, I don't have that kind of imagination." In other words, "You loser. Like, why do you waste your time imagining these foolish things that don't exist?" And when he eventually passed, I was overwhelmed with everything, just all the messes that he left to be cleaned up. And it was just a terrible time for me. And I suffered a very appropriate slight back injury that symbolized how I felt. And a friend of mine said, "I know this guy in Laurel Canyon who can help you. He releases trauma through physical therapy, and just go see him, and he can help you feel better." So I went to see this guy. He set me on the massage table, and he didn't ask me much. He was like, "Why are you here?" I said, "I've got this pain in my back." And he said, "Anything traumatic happened to you recently?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "My dad died." I said, "Okay." And he was standing there. I guess he was meditating and preparing what he was going to do. And he got this weird look on his face. And then he said to me, "I am not a medium and I do not channel, but your dad is here. And he just keeps repeating something at me over and over and over again. And I have to tell you." And I thought, "Oh, brother, here we go." Right.
Like, great.
Yeah.
This
And
fucking guy.
yeah. And he says, "Your father wants you to know that he's learning to enjoy his imagination." That's a hell of a coincidence, my friend.
He didn't even know, did he?
He didn't know a thing about it. And neither did the person who sent me to him. So, yeah, that blew my mind. And then since then, I've had all kinds of experiences, strange things, that what do you call it? Communication? I'm not even sure what's happening in those situations, but there is something that happens. And I've been around people who have it very profoundly. Like even Tamara, was a tripping in a band with her, because things happen like, our engineer, for example, his mom died, and she started telling me, "Man," she was like, "Darren's mom is driving me nuts." And I was like, "What do you mean? What?" And she was like, "No, this woman just keeps coming at me and telling me to tell him something." And she doesn't like that. She's like, I don't like this stuff. So she told him something, and he said, no, that's not my mom. And then he went to the funeral and he talked to her sister, and it all turned out to be true. And I've seen her do that a bunch of times. And she's a good example of somebody who's got some kind of skill, but see, she doesn't want to make money or be known for it or anything like that. I mean, in fact, she kind of thinks of it as a pain, like I'm doing my own things. I don't want to have to relay messages and that kind of stuff. So I've known people like that as well. And she actually had a UFO experience when we were on tour once, which we did a song about called Everyone's Got an Area 51. Yeah.
Nice.
That's a pretty weird song. One of our weirder songs.
To look it up. Well, we got like 2 minutes left.
Okay.
It's Ronnie. It's been amazing. We appreciate it so much. A great show. And
been a good time.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
The book is American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World, Ronnie Pontiac. And thanks so much. Do you have a link or anything you want to give out?
They can just Google Google Ronnie Pontiac, and you'll find films and music and writing and all kinds of stuff.
Cool. Well, it's been great, and we appreciate it so much. And thanks to Bobby Dizzle. And
no problem.
Great show. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really like meeting you, Bobby and Jeffrey. Thanks so much.
You too, man.
Yeah,
it's always fun talking about alternate stuff.
Yeah, I hope we can swing back around sometime and continue our discussion.
Yeah, Bobby, you can get you two on his sometime. He loves this
sure,
stuff. I love it, and we'll get you back on. Keep me in the loop on future stuff, and
I will.
Usually, for sure, Inner Traditions. I've been working with them forever, so they usually.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I have a book I co-wrote with Tamara coming out in August, actually, from them. So.
Cool. We'll do that again with both of y'all.
Y'all have a great weekend.
All right. Have a great one, everybody.
Okay.
Stay out of trouble, everybody. Keep on moshing with the apocalypse, and watch out for Trumpagooches. Out for Trumpagooches. All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.
Take care. And